Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we will delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the silence of the mountains holds secrets that time has never been able to erase. Comment where you are watching us from now. In the autumn of 1896, as the leaves began to turn shades of rust and gold, the mountainous region of eastern Tennessee was a place where the modern world had not yet fully arrived. Communities lived isolated among deep valleys and steep peaks, connected only by narrow trails that snaked through dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. At that time, life was hard and lonely, especially for those who chose to make the mountains their permanent home. Electricity was just a distant dream, and news from the outside world arrived weeks late, brought by occasional travelers or the rare newspapers that managed to reach those altitudes. Ruth Calloway was known in the region as a woman of independent spirit. She lived alone in a wooden cabin near the Cades Cove Valley, one of the few settlements dotting that vast green and wild expanse. The area was known for its stunning landscapes, but also for its near-absolute isolation during the winter months, when snow blocked the paths and transformed each cabin into a solitary island amidst the white. There were rumors about Ruth, as there always are about those who choose solitude. Some said she was a widow, others that she had fled from some distant place, seeking a fresh start away from prying eyes. What everyone agreed on was that Ruth possessed profound knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, and that people from the surrounding area occasionally sought her help when conventional medicine failed or was too far away to reach in time. The cabin stood on the edge of the forest, where civilization ended and the true wilderness began. It was a simple but solid construction, with walls of interlocking logs covered in moss at the joints, and a stone chimney that smoked during the cold months, sending up a column of smoke visible from a distance. The roof was covered with wooden planks darkened by time and the constant dampness of the mountains. Around it, Ruth maintained a garden of medicinal plants that she cultivated with obsessive care. Neat rows of herbs that she harvested, dried and stored in carefully labeled glass jars. No one knew exactly how long she had lived there, but county records suggested she had been established there for at least a decade, perhaps more. Her nearest neighbors lived almost an hour's ride away, and even then Ruth rarely received visitors. She preferred to go down to town when she needed something, always maintaining a respectful but firm distance from attempts at approach. She wasn't rude, just reserved. She spoke only when necessary, bought what she needed, and returned to her chosen solitude. Some found this strange. Others admired her ability to live so independently in a world that wasn't kind to those who chose different paths. At the end of October of that year, when the first frosts began to blanket the valley during the early morning hours, and the air took on that characteristic smell of dead leaves and damp earth, Ruth was last seen in the nearest town, buying supplies for the approaching winter. The establishment was a general store that sold everything from fabrics to tools and served as an informal meeting point for the residents of the region to exchange news and gossip. The local merchant, a middle-aged man named Henry, would later recall that last visit in detail. Ruth seemed different that day. There was something in her eyes, a restlessness he hadn't noticed before. She constantly glanced over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone, and her hands trembled slightly as she counted the coins to pay for the groceries. Henry asked if everything was all right, and Ruth hesitated before answering. She said something vague about seeing strange movements in the woods near her cabin, shadows that shouldn't be there, sounds she couldn't identify. Henry tried to reassure her, saying they were probably just wild animals preparing for winter, but Ruth shook her head. They weren't animals, she was sure of it. She bought flour, salt, kerosene for her lamps, some extra candles, matches, and spare tools. She bought more than usual, as if preparing to be isolated for a longer period than normal. She paid with carefully counted coins, taken from a small leather pouch she kept tied to her waist. Before leaving, as she carried the packages to her horse tied outside, she mentioned something about unwanted visitors, but didn't elaborate when Henry asked for more details. She simply shook her head, mounted her horse, and followed the trail back to the mountains, disappearing among the trees as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the dusty path. That was the last time anyone saw Ruth Calloway alive. Weeks passed without anyone hearing from her. This wasn't unusual, as Ruth often spent long periods away from town, especially when the weather worsened. But when early December arrived and a farmer who lived relatively close by, about an hour away, noticed that there was no smoke coming from Ruth's chimney for several days in a row, unease began to grow in the community. Winter had already arrived in full force, bringing temperatures that dropped below freezing at night, and no one would survive in the mountains without a fire to keep warm and cook. The farmer, worried, mentioned his observation at the general store, and Henry immediately recalled his last conversation with Ruth, her strange behavior, and her words about unwanted visitors. Concern spread quickly. A small group of men, including Henry and the farmer, decided to hike to the cabin to check if everything was all right. It was a difficult journey, especially with snow already beginning to accumulate on the higher trails. But they felt it was their duty as neighbors, even distant ones, to ensure Ruth's safety. The journey to Ruth's cabin took almost 2 hours on that cold December morning. The group of men rode in silence, their horses carefully treading the trail, covered by a thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight. The air was so icy that each breath formed small clouds of vapor, and the sound of the animals' hooves echoed among the leafless trees. Henry was leading the way, followed by 4 other local men who had volunteered to accompany him. They all knew Ruth only superficially, but in the mountains, there is an unwritten code of looking out for one another, especially when winter arrives. As they climbed the slopes, the landscape became increasingly wild. The trees grew denser, their intertwined branches forming a natural canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. Occasionally, the group passed small frozen streams, their waters transformed into ribbons of ice that shimmered in the little light that filtered through the treetops. It was a place of undeniable beauty, but also laden with a heavy solitude that seemed to press against the chest of anyone who ventured there. When they finally spotted the cabin in the middle of a natural clearing, everyone immediately noticed that something was wrong. The chimney emitted no smoke, and the snow around the building remained untouched without any recent footprints. The windows were dark, devoid of that welcoming light that should shine from within on a winter's day. The place seemed abandoned, forgotten, as if there had been no life there for a long time. Henry felt a pang in his stomach, that unsettling feeling that arises when we instinctively know we are about to discover something we would rather not know. They dismounted silently and slowly approached the cabin. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the cold wind that swept down from the higher slopes. It was strange because Ruth always kept everything locked and secure, especially with winter approaching. Henry was the first to push the door open completely, and the creaking of the rusty hinges broke the silence almost violently. What they saw inside made them all stop at the threshold, hesitant to enter. The cabin was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, the wooden table tipped over, broken chairs scattered across the floor. Ceramic plates and bowls were in pieces, mixed with the contents of the pantry that had been strewn throughout the room. Flour, grains, and dried herbs covered the wooden floor like a layer of dirty snow. The glass jars where Ruth kept her medicines were broken, their contents spilled and mixed in a jumble of colors and textures. The shelves had been ripped from the walls, and books that Ruth had kept carefully organized were scattered, their pages torn and crumpled. But Ruth wasn't there. There was no sign of her, no clue to her whereabouts. The men searched every corner of the small building, checked the attic where she kept extra provisions, even looked under the bed, but found nothing but disorder and destruction. It was as if she had simply vanished, evaporated into the icy mountain air. Her clothes were still hanging in a corner. Her personal belongings were still there, though scattered and rummaged through. Even her heavy winter coat remained hanging near the door, which was especially unsettling considering the intense cold outside. What troubled the men most, however, were the symbols. On the wooden walls of the cabin, someone had drawn strange marks using what appeared to be charcoal or ash. They weren't letters from any alphabet any of them recognized, nor were they drawings that made immediate sense. They seemed ancient, primitive, composed of straight and curved lines that intertwined in peculiar ways. Some symbols were small, discreet, hidden in corners and behind furniture. Others were large, occupying entire areas of the wall, as if whoever designed them wanted to make sure they were impossible to ignore. Henry ran his hand over one of the larger symbols, feeling the rough texture of the charcoal against the wood. There was something deeply unsettling about those marks, a sense that they carried some important meaning he couldn't quite grasp. One of the other men, an older farmer named Thomas, who had lived in the mountains all his life, was particularly disturbed. He said he had seen similar marks once many years ago, in ancient ruins he had found while hunting in the more remote parts of the mountains. At the time, he thought they were just meaningless scribbles left by travelers or by peoples who had inhabited those lands long before the arrival of European settlers. They decided they needed to document what they had found. Henry had a small notebook where he recorded sales at his warehouse, and he used some blank pages to make quick sketches of the most prominent symbols. His hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the unease that place caused. There was something wrong with that cabin, something that went beyond mere physical disorder. The air seemed heavy, laden with a tension that none of them could explain, but that they all felt. After thoroughly searching the cabin without finding any clue as to Ruth's whereabouts, the group decided to search the surrounding area. Perhaps she had fled into the woods, or perhaps there were signs of a struggle outside that the snow had not yet completely covered. They split into pairs and began to scour the area around the clearing, calling out Ruth's name, hoping against all hope to hear a response. The search revealed little. There were old footprints half erased by snow and time, impossible to determine if they belonged to Ruth or someone else. The medicinal herb garden she cultivated with such care was dead, the plants darkened by frost, hanging withered over the frozen earth. The small barn where Ruth kept tools and her horse was empty. The animal wasn't there, which could mean Ruth had left on horseback, but its saddle and harness remained hanging on the barn wall, untouched. Thomas found something strange near the edge of the forest, where the trees were beginning to engulf the clearing. It was an area where the undergrowth seemed to have been recently disturbed. Broken branches and ruffled leaves, as if something or someone had passed by in a hurry. But the trail, if it was a trail at all, disappeared after a few meters, lost among the trees and snow. They tried to follow it, but soon realized it would be useless. The forest was too vast, and without a clear direction, they could wander for days without finding anything. As the sun began to set on the horizon, tinging the sky with orange and purple hues, the group decided to return to the city. There was nothing more they could do there that day, and remaining in the forest after nightfall would be dangerous. The mountains were territory of wild animals, and the complete darkness that descended upon those lands when the sun set was absolute, with no moon or stars visible through the dense cloud cover that often shrouded the peaks. News of Ruth Calloway's disappearance spread quickly through the mountain communities of eastern Tennessee. In the weeks following the discovery of the abandoned cabin, the case became the main topic of conversation around campfires and at Sunday gatherings in the small wooden churches that dotted the region. People spoke in hushed tones, speculating about what might have happened to this solitary woman who had chosen to live so far from everyone. Some suggested she had simply decided to leave, abandon everything, and start over somewhere else, perhaps down to the plains where life was less harsh. Others couldn't accept such a simple explanation, not after the state in which the cabin was found. The county sheriff, a middle-aged man named William Crawford, was officially informed of the disappearance a few days after its discovery. Crawford was known for being meticulous in his work, despite the limited resources at his disposal. In such a vast and isolated region, maintaining law and order was a constant challenge. Most of the crimes he dealt with were small disputes between neighbors, occasional cattle thefts, or tavern brawls that ended with one or another man spending the night in jail to cool off. A disappearance like this was something completely different, something that required more investigation than he was used to conducting. Crawford rode to the cabin, accompanied by Henry and 2 deputies who worked with him. The journey was even more difficult than it had been for the first group, as the snow continued to fall and the trails were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. When they finally arrived at the location in early January 1897, the cabin was covered by a thick layer of snow that had accumulated on the roof and around the walls. The place seemed even more abandoned and desolate than Henry remembered, as if nature itself were trying to erase any trace that anyone had ever lived there. The sheriff spent hours examining every detail of the cabin. He made careful notes in his notebook, drew diagrams of the furniture layout, and copied the strange symbols that still marked the walls. He was particularly intrigued by those markings. He asked everyone present if they recognized the symbols, if they knew of any language or code that resembled them. No one knew the answer. Crawford decided to make detailed copies of all the symbols, hoping that perhaps someone with more knowledge could identify them in the future. During his inspection, the sheriff found something the previous group had missed. In the darkest corner of the cabin, partially hidden under the wreckage of a fallen shelf, was a diary. It was a small book, bound in dark leather, worn by time and use. The pages were yellowed, some stained by liquids spilled during the chaos that had taken over the place. Crawford picked up the diary carefully, as if holding something sacred, and began to leaf through it slowly. The first pages contained notes on medicinal plants, detailed recipes for remedies, descriptions of symptoms and treatments, observations on the growth of different herbs at different times of the year. Ruth's handwriting was delicate yet firm, each word written with care. It was clear that she took her work very seriously, that she saw this knowledge as something valuable that needed to be preserved and documented. There were drawings of plants, sketches showing leaves, flowers, and roots in precise detail. It was the work of someone dedicated, someone who loved what she did. But as Crawford turned the pages, the tone of the notes began to change. The most recent entries, dated from the months before the disappearance, revealed a growing concern. Ruth wrote about feeling watched as she walked through the forest to gather her plants. She mentioned strange sounds at night, such as heavy footsteps circling her cabin, low voices conversing in a language she couldn't identify. At first, she tried to rationalize these experiences, attributing them to her imagination or to the natural sounds of the forest that she might not be interpreting correctly. One particularly disturbing entry, dated mid-October, described an encounter Ruth had while gathering herbs near a stream about an hour's walk from her cabin. She wrote that she saw figures among the trees, people who seemed to be watching her from afar. When she tried to approach them to greet them, as was her custom when meeting other mountain dwellers, the figures retreated into the forest and disappeared. Ruth felt that something was deeply wrong about that encounter, something she couldn't explain, but which left her profoundly uneasy. In the last pages she wrote, just days before her final visit to the city, Ruth mentioned encountering the symbols. She wrote that upon returning from one of her walks, she found marks drawn on the door of her cabin. They weren't random scribbles, but deliberate and carefully crafted symbols. Ruth tried to erase them, but the next day they reappeared, this time in greater numbers, scattered around her property. She wrote that she felt as if someone was trying to send a message, a warning, although she didn't know how to interpret their meaning. The last diary entry was especially unsettling. Dated the day before her last visit to the city, Ruth wrote in noticeably shaky, less controlled handwriting than usual. She mentioned waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the outside walls of her cabin. The sound continued for hours, moving around the building as if something were slowly circling it. Ruth lit all her lamps, grabbed the rifle she kept for protection against wild animals, and stayed awake until dawn, hoping that whatever was outside would go away. When she finally ventured out in the daylight, she found no footprints or marks to explain the sound, only more symbols drawn on the outside wall, larger and more elaborate than the previous ones. The entrance ended with a sentence that Crawford read aloud to the others present, his voice echoing in the frigid silence of the abandoned cabin. Ruth had written that she planned to go to town the next day to seek help, to tell someone what was happening. She hoped the sheriff might send someone to investigate, to find out who was doing this and why, but she never had the chance to make that report in person. The conversation with Henry at the general store was the closest she came to asking for help before disappearing completely. Crawford slowly closed the diary, his face expressing the confusion everyone felt. What did it all mean? Who was harassing Ruth like that? And more importantly, where was she now? The sheriff decided to take the diary with him, along with his sketches of the symbols on the walls. Perhaps there was someone somewhere who could help decipher this mystery. Before leaving, he instructed his deputies to conduct a more thorough search of the area, but the harsh winter made any effort nearly impossible. The snow covered everything, erasing any trace that might exist. During the following weeks, Crawford tried to find answers. He spoke to everyone who knew Ruth, however superficially. He asked about her past, about where she had come from before settling in the mountains, but he discovered that no one really knew anything about Ruth's life before she arrived in that region. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere more than 10 years ago, bringing only her knowledge of herbs and her desire to live in isolation. There were no official records beyond those related to the ownership of her cabin, no saved correspondence, no connection with family or friends. The winter of 1897 was particularly harsh in the Tennessee mountains. Snow fell incessantly for weeks, piling up in waist-deep layers in some areas. Temperatures plummeted overnight, freezing streams and turning waterfalls into ice sculptures. For Sheriff Crawford, these conditions meant that any attempt to continue the search for Ruth would have to wait until spring. The trails were impassable, and sending men to scour the vast expanse of snow-covered forest would put more lives at risk with no guarantee of results. During those months of forced waiting, Crawford devoted himself to trying to understand the symbols he had copied from the walls of Ruth's cabin. He showed his drawings to the pastor of the local church, an educated man who owned several books on history and ancient languages. The pastor examined the symbols carefully, comparing them with illustrations in his volumes, but found nothing that resembled them. He suggested that perhaps they were markings of some native tribe that inhabited those lands long before the colonizers arrived, but even this theory didn't seem to fit perfectly. Crawford also sought out a traveling merchant who occasionally passed through the region, a man who had traveled much of the country and seen many different things on his journeys. The merchant looked at the symbols with interest, turning Crawford's notebook over from different angles, frowning in concentration. After some time, he commented that he had seen vaguely similar markings on his travels through the Great Lakes region, where some of the oldest native peoples had left petroglyphs on rock formations. But even he admitted that he wasn't sure, and that Ruth's symbols seemed to have something unique, something that didn't quite fit any known pattern. Meanwhile, in the community around Cades Cove, speculation about Ruth's disappearance continued to grow and multiply. On cold nights, when families gathered around the fire, stories about the solitary woman who lived in the mountains were told and retold, each time gaining new details and interpretations. Some believed that Ruth had been a victim of bandits who roamed the mountains, preying on people who lived in isolation. Others thought that perhaps she had enemies from the past, people who followed her to her mountain refuge to settle old scores. There were also those who offered darker, less rational explanations. In the Appalachian Mountains, especially in the older, more isolated communities, stories still circulated about things that inhabited the deep forests. Legends passed down through generations about spirits that wandered among the trees, about places where the veil between our world and something else was too thin. Some of the older residents remembered other disappearances over the years, people who entered the forest and were never seen again, cases that were never solved and eventually forgotten by time. One of these people was a lady named Margaret, who had lived on a small farm for almost 70 years and knew the mountains as well as anyone. She sought out Crawford in early February, saying she had something important to tell him. Seated in the small room that served as the sheriff's office, Margaret recounted a story her grandmother had told her when she was young. It spoke of a group of settlers who had established themselves in that same area over 100 years ago, at a time when those lands were even wilder and more unexplored than they are today. According to the story, this initial group of settlers had found something strange in the mountains: ancient ruins, stone structures covered in moss and vegetation, which were clearly not of Native American origin. The constructions were unlike anything they knew, made with techniques and patterns they couldn't understand, and on the walls of these ruins there were symbols engraved in the stone, markings that the settlers tried but failed to decipher. The story says that those first inhabitants began to have strange experiences after discovering the ruins. Visions at night, inexplicable sounds coming from the forest, the constant feeling of being watched. Margaret said her grandmother recounted how the group eventually decided to abandon that specific location and move to another area of the mountains, leaving the ruins behind and trying to forget what they had found. But some of the symbols Margaret described in her story, passed down through generations only by oral tradition, sounded remarkably similar to those Crawford had copied from Ruth's cabin. The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be that Ruth had discovered these same ancient ruins, that she was being harassed because of this knowledge? Crawford asked Margaret if she knew where those ruins might be located. The old woman shook her head slowly. The story had been told so long ago, and the exact location had never been precisely preserved. She only knew that they were somewhere in the higher areas of the mountains, in a region where few ventured because the terrain was particularly difficult and dangerous. Crawford carefully noted everything down in his notebook, adding another piece to the confusing puzzle he was trying to assemble. When spring finally arrived in April 1897, melting the snow and revealing the frozen ground beneath, Crawford organized a more systematic search of the area around Ruth's cabin. He gathered a group of volunteers, men who knew the mountains well and were willing to dedicate their time to helping solve the mystery. For several weeks they scoured the forest in every direction, following every trail, exploring every valley and every hillside. They searched for signs of Ruth, for her clothes, for any evidence that could explain what happened to her. The search yielded few concrete results. They found some objects that might have belonged to Ruth, small things scattered throughout the forest that the rain and thaw had revealed. A cloth scarf tangled in a branch, so worn that it was impossible to be certain of its origin. Some old coins buried in the mud near a stream, which could have fallen from anyone's pocket over the years. Nothing conclusive, nothing that really advanced the investigation. The forest had kept its secrets well, if there were any secrets to be revealed. During one of these search expeditions, one of the volunteers drew attention to something he found in a particularly remote area of the mountains, several hours' walk from Ruth's cabin. It was a rock formation that appeared to have been altered by human hands long ago. Large stones were stacked in a way that could not be natural, forming something that vaguely resembled a structure or monument. Moss covered the entire surface, and trees had grown among the stones, their roots intertwining with the rock in a way that suggested it had been there for decades, perhaps centuries. Crawford and his men examined the formation carefully. They cleared away some of the moss and vegetation, revealing the surface of the stone beneath, and there, engraved in the rock with depth that had withstood the passage of time, were symbols. The same types of markings that Crawford had seen on the walls of Ruth's cabin. The resemblance was unmistakable. Straight lines and curves intertwined, patterns that repeated themselves in subtle variations, a visual language that seemed to carry meaning, but remained completely incomprehensible to the observer. The discovery was both exciting and frustrating. It confirmed that the symbols had some connection to that specific region of the mountains, that Ruth hadn't invented or imagined them, but it still didn't explain what they meant, who had created them, or what any of it had to do with her disappearance. Crawford ordered his men to document everything carefully, making more drawings and notes about the exact location of the ruins. Perhaps one day, someone with more knowledge could analyze this information and finally decipher the mystery. With the discovery of the ancient ruins, the investigation took a completely different turn. Crawford realized he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple disappearance. There were layers of history buried in those mountains, secrets that had remained hidden beneath the moss and vegetation indefinitely. The sheriff decided he needed expert help, someone who could offer perspectives that he and his men simply didn't possess. In May 1897, Crawford sent letters to several universities in the eastern part of the country, describing the symbols he had found and the peculiar circumstances of the case. He attached careful copies of the drawings he had made, both of the markings on the cabin and those etched into the rock formations. Most institutions did not respond, probably considering the correspondence of a sheriff from a remote mountainous region as something of no academic importance. But one reply did arrive, from an anthropology professor at the University of Virginia named Dr. Edmund Harrington. Harrington expressed genuine interest in the case. In his letter, he explained that he had spent years studying the peoples who inhabited the Appalachian region before the arrival of European colonists, and that he was always seeking new evidence that could expand understanding of these ancient cultures. The symbols described by Crawford particularly intrigued him, as they did not resemble the patterns typically associated with known tribes of the region. He proposed visiting Tennessee personally during the summer, when travel conditions would be more favorable, to examine the findings firsthand. While waiting for the professor to arrive, Crawford continued his investigation in other ways. He spoke extensively with Margaret, the elderly woman who had shared her grandmother's story about the first settlers. Through these conversations, he learned more about the local legends circulating in the mountains. Margaret recounted other stories she had heard throughout her long life, accounts from people who claimed to have seen strange things in the deepest forests. Lights moving among the trees without apparent source, sounds of voices singing in unknown languages, the persistent feeling of an invisible presence, watching those who ventured too far from the known trails. What most caught Crawford's attention was a pattern he began to notice in these accounts. Many of the stories were connected to the same general area of the mountains where the ruins had been found. It was a particularly remote region, characterized by deep valleys and steep peaks, where the rugged terrain discouraged exploration. Even the most experienced hunters avoided that area, not out of outright fear, but out of an instinctive unease they couldn't rationally explain. They said that the animals also seemed to avoid that place, that the forest there was strangely silent, devoid of the normal sounds of wildlife that characterized the rest of the mountains. Crawford began to wonder if Ruth had discovered that area during her expeditions to collect medicinal plants. She frequently walked alone through the forest, always searching for specific species that grew only under certain conditions. Could her searches have led her to that remote valley, to the ancient ruins? And if so, what would she have found there? The diary discovered in the cabin didn't specifically mention any ruins, but the last entries were so disorganized and fragmented that perhaps Ruth hadn't had enough mental clarity to document everything properly. Professor Harrington arrived in early July, traveling by train to the nearest town and then completing the rest of the journey on horseback. He was an academic-looking man, with grey hair and thin-rimmed glasses, but he proved surprisingly robust and well-adapted to the hardships of mountain life. He brought with him various measuring and documentation equipment, as well as a collection of books and notes on ancient cultures that he had studied over the years. Crawford first took Harrington to Ruth's abandoned cabin. The building had remained untouched since the sheriff's last visit, preserved exactly as it had been found months before. The professor spent hours examining the symbols on the walls, measuring them, photographing them with a heavy camera he had brought especially for this purpose. He compared the markings with illustrations in his books, murmuring to himself in deep concentration. Occasionally, he asked Crawford questions about the exact circumstances of the disappearance, about the state in which the cabin was found, about any detail that might seem relevant. After completing his examination of the cabin, Harrington asked to be taken to the ruins in the mountains. The journey took most of the following day, as the location was remote and the terrain difficult. When they finally arrived at the moss-covered rock formations, the professor was visibly impressed. He walked around the ancient structures, touching the stones reverently, tracing the engraved symbols with his fingers. His excitement was palpable, and he commented that this was a significant discovery, something that could change the understanding of who inhabited those lands in ancient times. Harrington explained that the symbols definitely did not belong to any of the known native cultures of the Appalachian region. The way they were constructed, the patterns they followed, all suggested something different, perhaps older than any other documented archaeological remains in that area. He theorized that there might have been a completely unknown culture that lived in the mountains in ancient times, perhaps thousands of years ago, and that these ruins were the only remaining traces of its existence. Over the following days, Harrington conducted a more detailed exploration of the area around the ruins. He discovered that there were more structures hidden beneath the dense vegetation, forming what appeared to be a small complex of ancient buildings. In some places, he found artifacts buried in the ground, fragments of pottery and stone tools that appeared extremely old. Each discovery was carefully documented, photographed, and catalogued. The professor was clearly enthusiastic, seeing this as the most important fieldwork of his career. But as he spent more time at that location, Harrington began to experience some of the same sensations that Ruth had described in her diary. He mentioned to Crawford that he felt a growing unease when working in the ruins, a feeling of being watched even when he was sure they were alone. At night, camped nearby, he claimed to hear sounds he couldn't identify, movements in the forest that seemed too deliberate to be just animals. Crawford noticed that the professor became progressively more nervous, frequently looking over his shoulder, insisting on keeping a large campfire burning all night. One night in particular was especially disturbing. Harrington woke Crawford in the middle of the night, urgently whispering that he had seen lights moving among the trees. They weren't ordinary torches or lanterns, but something different, a pale, erratic glow that seemed to float without an apparent source. The two men stayed awake until dawn, watching the forest, trying to understand what they had witnessed. When daylight finally arrived, they found no physical evidence to explain the lights, no footprints or marks to indicate the presence of other people in the area. After this incident, Harrington suggested that perhaps it would be better to complete his research more quickly and return to civilization. He admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he was beginning to understand why that area of the mountains had a reputation for being unsettling. There was something about that place that affected people in subtle but undeniable ways, an atmosphere that couldn't be explained simply by isolation or an overactive imagination. Over the next 2 days, he worked quickly to complete his measurements and notes, always staying close to Crawford and avoiding being alone among the ruins. Before leaving the mountains to return to the University of Virginia, Harrington had a long conversation with Crawford about his conclusions. He believed the ruins were genuinely ancient, possibly hundreds or even thousands of years old. The symbols represented some kind of language or writing system that had not been preserved anywhere else, making their translation virtually impossible without further context. As for Ruth's disappearance, He had no definitive answers, but suggested that perhaps she had discovered something in the ruins that put her in danger in some way not yet understood. After Professor Harrington's departure, Crawford found himself in a difficult position. He had more questions than answers, and the investigation seemed to have reached a point where conventional police methods were simply insufficient. Ruth's disappearance remained a complete mystery, and the discovery of the ancient ruins only made the whole case more complex and perplexing. The sheriff spent weeks reviewing his notes, rereading Ruth's diary, trying to find some connection he might have missed. During this time, something unexpected happened. In late August 1897, a man arrived in town specifically looking for Crawford. He was a middle-aged man, simply but properly dressed, with a face weathered by time spent outdoors. He introduced himself as Jonathan Pierce and said he had traveled from the mountains of northern North Carolina after hearing rumors about the Ruth Calloway case. What he had to say would intrigue Crawford even more. Pierce explained that he had worked as a hunting guide in the mountains for over 20 years, knowing trails and remote areas that few others had explored. During his expeditions, he occasionally found traces of ancient human occupation, places where someone had clearly lived or built something long ago. Over the years, he had developed a particular interest in these discoveries, documenting them as best he could, even without formal training in archaeology or history. The reason for his trip to Tennessee was that Pierce believed he had found symbols similar to those described in rumors about Ruth's case. During his expeditions through the mountains of North Carolina, he had discovered a series of natural caves that showed signs of ancient human use. On the walls of these caves were drawings and engravings that included some of the same symbolic patterns he had heard associated with Ruth's disappearance. Pierce brought with him his own sketches of these markings, made over several years of exploration. When Crawford compared Pierce's drawings with his own copies of the symbols found in Ruth's cabin and the ruins, the resemblance was undeniable. They weren't identical, but they clearly shared a common style, a visual language that transcended state lines. This suggested that whatever those symbols were, they weren't unique to that specific area of Tennessee. There was a wider geographic distribution, spreading across the Appalachian Mountains through multiple states. Pierce shared another piece of information he thought was relevant. During his travels, he had spoken with older residents of various mountain communities, people whose families had lived in that region for generations. Many of them knew stories about the areas where the symbols were found. There was a consistent pattern in these stories, a common theme that those places should be avoided, that they were places where strange things happened, and where people who ventured there alone sometimes did not return. What intrigued Crawford most was when Pierce mentioned that, in his informal research, he had found fragmentary records of other disappearances over the years, cases that were never properly investigated or documented. These were mainly people who lived isolated in the mountains, solitary individuals like Ruth, who chose lives away from larger communities. The disappearances were spread over decades, occurring in different areas but always in remote mountain regions where the mysterious symbols were found. Crawford asked Pierce if he had any theory about what might connect all these seemingly disparate elements. The guide hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to suggest. He said that over his years in the mountains, he'd come to the conclusion that there were places in those lands that carried something difficult to explain. It wasn't something he could prove or demonstrate scientifically, but it was a feeling that anyone who spent enough time in those specific locations would eventually experience. A presence, an awareness that those areas weren't completely empty or abandoned, even when there was seemingly no one around. The two men talked for hours that day, comparing notes and sharing observations. Pierce offered to take Crawford to the caves in North Carolina he had mentioned, so the sheriff could see the similarities for himself. Crawford accepted the offer, seeing it as an opportunity to expand his understanding of the case. In early September, the two set off on a journey that would take several days, crossing the state line and venturing into the mountains of northern North Carolina. The caves Pierce had discovered were in a particularly isolated area, accessible only via difficult trails that required hiking for the last few kilometers. When they finally arrived, Crawford immediately understood why the place had remained relatively unknown. The entrance to the main cave was partially hidden by dense vegetation, and the surrounding area had that same unsettling silence he had noticed near the ruins in Tennessee. The birds didn't sing there, and even the wind seemed to blow more quietly. Inside the cave, by the light of his flashlights, Crawford saw the symbols Pierce had mentioned. They covered large sections of the rock walls, some drawn with pigments that had partially withstood the test of time, others engraved directly into the stone. The similarity to the symbols he had documented was striking, not just a few isolated markers, but entire repeating patterns, strongly suggesting they had been created by the same culture, or at least by cultures that shared a common symbolic language. But there was something else in the caves, signs of use far more recent than the ancient engravings, ashes from campfires that didn't seem to be more than a few months old, remnants of provisions, marks in the earth suggesting that someone had camped there recently. Pierce was surprised, as he had visited those caves only 6 months ago and hadn't seen any of these signs of recent occupation. Someone had been there between his last visit and now, using the caves as temporary shelter. Crawford examined the remains carefully, searching for any clue as to who might have been there. He found a few objects left behind, small things that could have belonged to any traveler. But one item in particular caught his eye, making his heart race. It was a small glass jar, the kind used to store medicinal herbs. The glass was partially broken, but there were still dried residues clinging to the inside, remnants of some plant that had been stored there. The shape and style of the jar were identical to those Crawford had seen in Ruth's cabin. The discovery was both thrilling and deeply disturbing. Could Ruth have made it to those caves, a considerable distance from her home in Tennessee? The journey would have taken days, through difficult and dangerous terrain. Why would she make such a trip? And if she had really been there, where was she now? The vial was the first tangible evidence of Ruth's whereabouts since her disappearance, but it raised more questions than it answered. Pierce and Crawford spent the rest of that day exploring the caves deeper and the surrounding area, searching for more clues. They found further indications of recent human presence, including footprints preserved in the mud in a deeper section of the cave that rarely dried completely. The footprints were small, about the size a woman would wear, and appeared to have been made by work boots of the type Ruth wore, but the footprints led deeper and deeper into the cave, into sections where darkness was total and where the rocky ceiling dropped so low that crawling was necessary to continue. Crawford wanted to follow the footprints, but Pierce advised against it. The deeper sections of those caves were dangerous, with sudden pits and narrow passages where a person could easily get trapped or lost. Furthermore, it was getting late, and remaining inside the caves after nightfall would be extremely risky. Reluctantly, Crawford agreed to return the next day with more preparation and proper cave exploration equipment. That night, camped near the entrance to the caves, the two men discussed what they had found and what it could mean. If Ruth had truly traveled there, she was clearly fleeing from something or searching for something. Her diary had mentioned feeling pursued, as if there were unwanted visitors around her cabin. Perhaps she had decided that the only way to escape was to venture deeper into the mountains, seeking refuge in places so remote that no one would follow her. Or perhaps she was searching for answers about the symbols that had begun appearing around her property, answers she believed she could find by exploring other locations where the same symbols existed. The following morning, Crawford and Pierce carefully prepared to explore the deeper sections of the caves. They carried extra flashlights, ropes, and enough provisions in case they were trapped longer than planned. The cave entrance seemed even more ominous in the daylight, the darkness beyond the rocky opening appearing to swallow any approaching sound. The two men exchanged a silent glance before entering, both feeling the gravity of what they were about to do. The first sections of the caves were familiar to Pierce from his previous explorations, natural stone corridors where the light from their flashlights danced on the damp walls, creating unsettling shadows. They followed the footprints they had found the previous day, watching as they continued toward the depths of the rock formation. As they advanced, the ceiling became progressively lower, eventually forcing them to bend down and then crawl in some particularly narrow sections. It was in one of these narrower passages that Crawford found something wedged between the rocks. It was a piece of torn fabric, the kind of sturdy material used to make work clothes. The fabric was dirty and worn, but Crawford immediately recognized the pattern. It was identical to the dress witnesses had described Ruth wearing during her last visit to the city. He carefully kept the piece of fabric, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were definitely on the right track, but the deteriorated state of the fabric suggested that much time had passed since Ruth had been there. They continued advancing. Following the footprints that occasionally reappeared in sections of softer ground, the air grew increasingly heavy and humid as they descended, and Crawford could hear the distant sound of running water echoing through the rocky passages. Pierce remarked that there must be an underground river somewhere deeper down, a common feature in that type of geological formation. The caves of the Appalachians were known for their complex underground water systems that snaked through the limestone rocks for miles. After nearly 2 hours of careful exploration, they reached a larger chamber where the ceiling rose again, allowing them to stand upright. The room was impressive, with stalactite formations hanging from the ceiling like stone fingers reaching towards the floor. But what immediately caught their attention were the symbols. The walls of that chamber were covered with them, much more densely than in the sections near the entrance. Some were carved in stone, others painted with pigments that still retained vibrant colors despite the passage of time. It was like being inside a gigantic book, written in a completely alien language. In the center of the chamber, there was clear evidence that someone had stayed there for some time. The remains of a long-extinguished campfire, some objects scattered around, and what appeared to be a makeshift sleeping area made of branches and dry moss. Crawford approached cautiously, illuminating the area with his flashlight. Among the objects left behind, he recognized more items that definitely belonged to Ruth. Her worn leather bag, now empty. A small book she used to take notes on plants, its pages wavy from the dampness but still largely legible. Pierce called Crawford over to see something on the opposite wall of the chamber. There, separate from the ancient symbols, were new drawings. They were less refined, done with charcoal or something similar, but unmistakably recent. And most importantly, Crawford recognized the handwriting. They were the same marks he had seen in Ruth's diary, the same hand that had documented medicinal recipes and observations about plants. Ruth had definitely been in that chamber and had spent enough time there to make her own additions to the ancient walls. But Ruth's markings were not merely copies of the ancient symbols. She had created something new, a series of drawings that seemed to attempt to connect the different symbols, to trace relationships between them. It was as if she were trying to decipher the language, to find patterns and meanings in the ancient markings. Next to some symbols, she had written words in English, apparent attempts at translation or interpretation. Crawford read some of these notes aloud. Words like passage, protection, warning, threshold appeared repeatedly, always with question marks next to them, suggesting that Ruth was unsure of her interpretations. What disturbed Crawford most was a particular section of the wall where Ruth had written something longer, a note that seemed to be addressed to whoever found it. The writing was irregular, shaky, unlike her normally controlled handwriting. The message said that she had discovered something important about the symbols, something that explained many of the strange experiences she had had around her cabin. She wrote about following a pattern in the markings, a kind of map that led from one place with symbols to another, and that this map eventually led to a place she called the origin. But the note ended abruptly, in the middle of a sentence, as if Ruth had been interrupted while writing. Pierce pointed to another passage leading from that chamber, a narrow opening that led even deeper into the bowels of the mountain. Ruth's footprints led in that direction, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns. Crawford felt a chill run down his spine. How far had Ruth gone? And what had she found, if anything, in those unexplored depths? The two men debated whether they should continue. Their flashlights had already consumed a good portion of their oil, and venturing deeper into the caves with limited light would be extremely dangerous. Furthermore, there was no guarantee they would find their way back if they got lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. As much as Crawford wanted to continue, reason prevailed. They needed to return to the surface, replenish their supplies, and possibly gather more people for a proper exploration of the depths. Before leaving, Crawford meticulously documented everything. He sketched Ruth's notes on the walls, copied the new symbols she had created, and collected the objects left behind as evidence. Each item was carefully packed, every detail noted in his notebook, already nearly full of observations about the case. The return journey through the narrow passages seemed to take even longer than the descent, each movement cautious to avoid injury or falls in the most dangerous sections. When they finally emerged from the caves into the daylight, both needed a few moments to adjust their eyes to the brightness of the sun. The contrast between the claustrophobic darkness of the depths and the openness of the mountains was almost shocking. Crawford sat on a rock near the entrance, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair as he tried to process everything they had discovered. Ruth had definitely been in those caves, had spent significant time exploring and trying to understand the ancient symbols, but where was she now? Pierce broke the silence by suggesting they should return to civilization and organize a larger expedition. They needed more men, more equipment, and ideally someone with experience in deep cave exploration. Crawford agreed, but a part of him hesitated to leave that place. He felt he was close to something important, that the answers he sought lay somewhere deep within those caves, waiting to be discovered. But he also recognized that acting impulsively could result in more tragedy, in more disappearances that would never be explained. In the following days, as they made the long journey back to Tennessee, Crawford couldn't stop thinking about Ruth's notes on the cave walls. The word origin kept echoing in his mind. What did Ruth mean by that? Origin of what? Of the symbols? Of the people who had created them? Or something else? Something she had discovered but hadn't had a chance to fully document? The questions multiplied, each partial answer generating dozens of new ones. When Crawford finally returned to his office, he found mail waiting for him. One of the letters was from Professor Harrington of the University of Virginia. The academic wrote that he had shared his findings in the Tennessee mountains with colleagues from other institutions, and that there was growing interest in the case. Several experts in ancient cultures were willing to travel to the region to conduct more extensive research. Harrington also mentioned that he had found references in obscure historical texts to a lost civilization that supposedly inhabited the Appalachian Mountains in prehistoric times, a culture that left few traces, but was remembered in legends of various native tribes in the region. Crawford responded immediately, providing details about the caves in North Carolina and the new discoveries related to Ruth. He emphasized the urgency of the situation, the fact that a woman was still missing, and that each passing day diminished the chances of finding her alive. But even as he wrote, Crawford knew that the realistic chances of Ruth still being alive were minimal. Almost 10 months had passed since her disappearance, and the rigors of surviving alone in the mountains and caves for so long were nearly impossible to overcome. The autumn of 1897 arrived, bringing with it a noticeable shift in the Ruth Calloway case. What had begun as an investigation into an isolated disappearance in the Tennessee mountains had transformed into something much larger, attracting the attention of academics, explorers, and even journalists from distant cities. The discovery of ancient symbols and intricate caves had captured the imagination of many, transforming that remote corner of the Appalachians into an unexpected focal point of interest. In October of that year, an organized expedition finally arrived in the region. The group included Professor Harrington and 2 of his colleagues from the University of Virginia, as well as 3 experienced explorers specializing in cave systems. Crawford and Pierce accompanied them, serving as local guides who knew the terrain and the specific locations that needed to be investigated. The group established a base camp near the caves in North Carolina, preparing for a systematic exploration that could take weeks. The expedition's initial discoveries were remarkable. As they explored increasingly deeper sections of the caves, the group found evidence of a far more extensive network than anyone had imagined. The caves connected through natural tunnels that snaked through the mountains, creating an underground labyrinth stretching for kilometers in multiple directions. And in many of these passages, especially in the larger chambers, there were symbols on the walls, thousands of them, forming what appeared to be an extensive record of some ancient culture that had used those subterranean spaces for reasons that could not yet be understood. Harrington was fascinated by the archaeological implications. He theorized that those caves had served as some kind of ceremonial or religious center, a sacred place where rituals were performed and knowledge was preserved through the symbols engraved and painted on the walls. The quantity and complexity of the markings suggested a sophisticated culture with an elaborate belief system, far more advanced than existing historical records about the region might suggest. But for Crawford, academic interest was secondary to the urgent question of Ruth's whereabouts. During the exploration, the group found more evidence of her passage. In several different chambers, there were signs that she had camped temporarily, always leaving small traces of her presence. Pieces of fabric, remains of food preserved by the cold, dry atmosphere of the caves, and ever more notes on the walls. Ruth had clearly moved through the cave system systematically, exploring methodically while trying to decipher the meaning of the ancient symbols. What gradually became clear through these discoveries was that Ruth wasn't just running away or hiding. She was on a deliberate quest, following some kind of pattern or trail through the caves. Her notes suggested that she had developed a theory about how the symbols worked, an understanding that they weren't merely decorative, but served as a kind of navigation system or map. She had written on one of the walls that the symbols pointed the way, that following her logic, it was possible to find what she kept calling the origin. On the 10th day of the expedition, the group made a discovery that would change everything. In one of the deepest sections of the caves, accessible only through a series of dangerous descents and nearly impossible to navigate passages, they found a chamber unlike any other. It was enormous, with the ceiling rising to a height of perhaps 15 meters, and the walls were almost perfectly smooth, as if they had been worked by skilled hands over many generations, and covering every available inch of the walls were symbols, arranged in intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story or convey some complex knowledge. In the center of the chamber was a rock formation that was clearly not natural. It was a constructed structure, made of carefully stacked stones forming something resembling an altar or platform. Around this structure were deliberately placed objects, finely worked stone tools, fragments of pottery decorated with smaller versions of the same symbols that covered the walls, and what appeared to be offerings of some kind, organic materials long since decayed but still visible in their general forms. Harrington was visibly excited. He declared that this was an archaeological discovery of monumental importance, irrefutable evidence of a sophisticated civilization that had existed in that region long before any known historical record. His colleagues agreed, already discussing plans to meticulously document everything and eventually bring in more equipment to carry out proper excavations. But Crawford was focused on something else he had noticed in the chamber. Near the central structure, there were more of Ruth's notes, but these were different from the others they had found during their exploration. The writing was more hurried, almost frantic, as if she were trying to record thoughts that came too quickly to be properly organized. She had written about finally understanding, about the symbols suddenly making sense, revealing a pattern she hadn't been able to see before. She mentioned that the origin was not a physical place, but rather a concept, an idea preserved through the millennia by those who had created the symbols. But there was something more unsettling in Ruth's last notes in that chamber. She wrote about not being alone, about being certain that there were others in the caves with her, not the pursuers who had frightened her in her hut, but something different, presences she described as guardians. She seemed both terrified and fascinated, unable to decide whether to flee or stay to learn more. The last sentence she wrote was especially unsettling. It simply said that she needed to go deeper, that there was a final chamber beyond that one where all the answers awaited. Crawford asked the explorers if there were any more passages leading out of that large chamber. They confirmed that there was, an opening in the opposite wall, partially hidden behind the central rock formation. It was narrow and descended at a steep angle, disappearing into the darkness. One of the explorers had briefly tried to investigate it, but retreated after only a few meters, saying that the passage was dangerously unstable and that proceeding further without proper equipment would be suicidal. The group debated what to do. Academics wanted to focus on documenting the camera they had already found, arguing that that discovery alone was enough to warrant months of careful study. Professional explorers warned of the dangers of attempting to navigate unknown passages without proper preparation. But Crawford felt they couldn't simply stop there, not when they were clearly following Ruth's last steps. After much discussion, they reached a compromise. Two of the explorers, accompanied by Crawford and Pierce, would conduct a preliminary investigation of the descending passage, going only as far as was reasonably safe. If they found anything significant, or if the passage proved navigable with additional equipment, they would return to plan a more thorough exploration. The academics would remain in the large chamber, beginning the documentation work that would be necessary regardless of what else they discovered. The descent through the narrow passage was one of the most challenging experiences Crawford had ever faced. The path was steep and uneven, requiring them to crawl in places and squeeze through openings that seemed impossible to cross. The surrounding rock groaned and creaked constantly, reminding them that they were in geologically unstable territory where a small landslide could permanently block them. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 30 minutes of careful descent, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous one, but equally impressive in its own way. The walls were not covered with symbols, but rather with something that appeared to be a more elaborate type of writing, lines of marks that flowed across the stone like sentences in a gigantic book. And on the chamber floor, carefully arranged as if prepared by deliberate hands, was a collection of personal objects that Crawford recognized immediately. These were Ruth's remaining belongings, her work boots, carefully removed and placed side by side, her coat neatly folded, her tool bag empty but intact, and beside it all, her original diary, the same one Crawford had found in the cabin but which he knew had been left behind. How had it gotten there? Were there two diaries? Or had Ruth returned to retrieve it at some point in her journey? Crawford picked up the journal with trembling hands. The last pages contained entries he had never seen before, written during Ruth's time in the caves. He read them by the light of his flashlight, his voice echoing softly in the confined space as he shared the words with the others. The final pages of Ruth's diary told a story Crawford could never have imagined. Her writing, though still recognizable, showed signs of transformation. The words were chosen with almost poetic care, describing experiences that defied rational explanation. Ruth wrote about spending weeks exploring caves, following the symbols as if they were a living map that gradually revealed itself as she learned to interpret them. She described moments of sudden clarity, when patterns that seemed random suddenly made perfect sense, revealing connections she had never considered possible. In one of the entries, Ruth mentioned having found a kind of underground library, chambers where knowledge was preserved, not in books, but on the walls themselves. She wrote that the civilization that had created those symbols had a profound understanding of the natural world, knowledge about plants, minerals, and the cycles of the earth that went far beyond what any known culture had documented. It was this knowledge that had initially attracted her, the promise of learning about remedies and cures that could help those she treated in her hut. But as her explorations continued, Ruth had discovered that the symbols dealt with much more than just natural medicine. They spoke of connections between places, of how certain locations in the mountains were linked in ways that transcended physical geography. She described feeling these connections herself, moments when she was deep in the caves, but could somehow sense the forest above, as if the two realities existed simultaneously in her consciousness. These were experiences that frightened and fascinated her in equal measure. One particularly revealing entry explained why Ruth hadn't returned to the surface. She wrote that after spending so much time in the caves, trying to return to her former life seemed impossible. It wasn't just the fear of those who had pursued her around her hut, although that fear still existed. It was deeper than that. She felt she had begun a journey of understanding that she couldn't simply abandon. The symbols had become a part of her, and she of them. Leaving the caves before fully understanding what they had to teach would be like leaving an unfinished book, a story without a conclusion. Ruth also wrote about not truly being alone in the caves. She described encounters with what she called guardians, presences she never saw directly, but could feel watching her, subtly guiding her in her explorations. They weren't threatening, she emphasized, but rather protective. It was as if the ancient civilization that had created that place had left behind not only symbols, but also some essence of itself, a residual consciousness that still inhabited the depths of the caves. Ruth admitted that she didn't fully understand what this meant, whether it was something literal or metaphorical, real or a product of her mind isolated for so long in the darkness. The last entries in the diary became increasingly philosophical. Ruth reflected on choices and consequences, on the price of knowledge and understanding. She wrote that she had discovered things the outside world wasn't ready to know, information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Symbols weren't just ancient history, they were tools, keys to understandings that could transform how people saw the world around them. And with that power came responsibility, a burden Ruth wasn't sure she wanted or could carry back to civilization. The last complete diary entry was dated mid-September 1897, just a few weeks before the expedition found it. Ruth wrote that she had finally reached what she believed to be the deepest chamber of the system, the heart of the caves, where the most important symbols were preserved. She described that place as an underground cathedral, a space of absolute stillness, where the weight of the mountain above seemed both oppressive and comforting. It was there that she planned to leave her diary and belongings, not as an end, but as a beginning, a marker for those who might follow her path in the future. But then there was one last entry, written in a hurried margin on the last page. Ruth had returned to her journal after thinking it was finished. The note simply said that she had found a passage whose symbols indicated it led out of the caves, not back the way she had entered, but through a different path that emerged somewhere far in the mountains. She wrote that she was going to follow that route, see where it led. Perhaps it was time to return to the surface world, bringing with her what she had learned, Or perhaps it was just the next step on a journey that still had no clear end. Crawford slowly closed the journal, his mind working to process everything he had read. Ruth had left that place, that much seemed clear. But where to? The mention of a different passage leading to another part of the mountains opened up both hopeful and worrying possibilities. Could it be that Ruth was still alive somewhere, having emerged from the caves in a remote area and simply chosen not to return to her former life? The explorers accompanying Crawford began to examine the chamber walls carefully, searching for signs of another passage. It took almost an hour, but eventually one of them found what they were looking for. Hidden behind a natural rock formation was a narrow opening so well camouflaged that it would be easy to pass through it without noticing. The passage was different from those they had reached before, showing signs of having been deliberately constructed or modified, with stones strategically positioned to create a navigable path through the solid rock. The exploration of this new passage would have to wait. The group was exhausted, their lanterns were low on fuel, and safety required them to return to the surface before attempting any further exploration. They carefully marked the location of the hidden passage, and Crawford guarded Ruth's journal with reverence, as the precious artifact it was. The journey back through the caves was made in contemplative silence, each of the men lost in their own thoughts about what they had discovered. When they finally emerged from the caves into the late afternoon light, the group was visibly shaken by the experience. Harrington and his academic colleagues were eager to hear about the findings, and Crawford shared the diary's contents with them. The revelation that Ruth had apparently found an alternate exit from the caves completely changed the nature of the search. She wasn't necessarily lost or in danger in the subterranean depths. She could have emerged anywhere along the vast Appalachian mountains. Professor Harrington suggested that they should try to map the entire cave system, follow the passage Ruth had taken, and see where it led. But this would be a massive undertaking, requiring weeks or even months of careful exploration. Professional explorers agreed that it was technically possible, but warned of the risks. The caves were unstable in many sections, and there was always the danger of cave-ins, flash floods from underground rivers, or simply getting lost in the miles of interconnected tunnels. Crawford made a decision. While the expedition continued its work documenting the archaeological discoveries, he and Pierce would return to the nearby mountain communities and begin asking questions. If Ruth had emerged from the caves somewhere in the mountains, someone might have seen her. Even in the most remote areas, there were hunters, loggers, or occasional travelers who might have crossed paths with a woman alone. It was a small chance, but it was something concrete they could do while the others continued the underground work. During the following weeks, Crawford and Pierce traveled extensively through the mountains of North Carolina and adjacent areas of Tennessee. They visited small, isolated communities, spoke with residents who rarely had contact with the outside world, and inquired in taverns and trading posts about any sightings of a woman traveling alone. Most people had nothing to report, but occasionally someone mentioned having heard rumors or second- or third-hand stories. A pattern began to emerge from these conversations. Several residents from different areas mentioned having heard of a strange woman who had appeared in their regions in recent months, someone who was from nowhere known, but who demonstrated profound knowledge of plants and remedies. She never stayed in one place for long, always moving on before people could ask too many questions. Some descriptions vaguely matched Ruth's appearance, but others were so different that it was impossible to be sure if they were talking about the same person. The following months brought more questions than answers. Crawford continued following fragmented clues through the mountains, each account leading to another, each story adding a new layer to the mystery that refused to be definitively solved. The archaeological expedition eventually concluded its initial work in the caves, documenting thousands of symbols and beginning the long process of trying to understand the lost civilization that had created them. But the passage that Ruth supposedly had taken remained unexplored, considered too dangerous to navigate without much more extensive preparation. The Ruth Calloway case gradually transformed from an active investigation into something more like a local legend. People in the mountains told stories about the solitary woman who disappeared into the caves and possibly emerged elsewhere, carrying ancient knowledge she had discovered deep within the earth. Some claimed to have seen her briefly, a figure passing among the trees at dusk. Others asserted that she had found a kind of peace in the mountains that she could never have achieved living among other people. Crawford eventually had to accept that he might never know for sure what happened to Ruth. The diary she left behind offered clues but no definitive conclusions. The caves kept their secrets as well as they always had. revealing only fragments of truth to those brave or foolish enough to explore them. The sheriff returned to his regular duties, but never forgot the case. He kept Ruth's diary in his office, consulting it occasionally, always hoping that some detail he had missed would suddenly reveal itself and offer clarity. Sometimes, during quiet nights, Crawford would think about the final words Ruth had written, about finding paths that led to unexpected places. He wondered if she had truly found what she sought in the depths of those ancient mountains, if the symbols had revealed their secrets, or if they remained as mysterious at the end as at the beginning. There was a certain beauty in the uncertainty, he eventually recognized, in the idea that some stories don't end neatly, but simply continue to echo through time. The mountains remained as they always had been, vast and indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes. The caves continued to exist in the depths, with their labyrinthine tunnels and walls covered in symbols that few would fully understand. And somewhere in that immensity of stone and forest, perhaps there were still answers waiting to be discovered by those willing to search in the shadows, where light rarely reaches. Ruth Calloway's story became part of the fabric of the Appalachian Mountains, another layer added to the centuries of mysteries those ancient lands held. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking knowledge in forgotten places. For others, it was a story of transformation, of someone who chose a different path and had the courage to follow it wherever it led. The truth, as often happens with the best stories, remained somewhere between interpretations, nebulous and elusive, like the mist that often shrouded the mountain valleys at dawn. The symbols in the caves continued to intrigue those who studied them. Some academics dedicated years to trying to decipher them, publishing theories and counter-theories that never reached a definitive consensus. The ruins discovered by Crawford and the expedition became the subject of occasional study, but the remote nature of their location and the inherent dangers of the caves kept most researchers at a distance. The knowledge those places contained remained largely inaccessible, protected both by geography and by the mystery that surrounded them. Crawford eventually retired from his post as sheriff, spending his final years in a small house in the mountains he loved so much. He occasionally received visitors interested in Ruth's case, journalists or enthusiasts of unsolved mysteries who had heard of the story and wanted to know more. To all of them, he recounted what he knew, showed the copies of the symbols he had preserved, and always ended his narratives in the same way, with a reminder that the mountains hold many secrets, and not all are meant to be revealed. And so the story remains, suspended between the known and the unknown, between the documented and the imagined. The Appalachian Mountains continue to rise majestically and mysteriously, their dense forests and deep caves guarding countless stories that may never be fully told. Ruth Calloway became part of these stories, her journey intertwined with the land itself, a reminder that there are still places where mystery prevails over certainty. For those who walk the ancient mountain trails today, the question occasionally arises of what really happened that distant autumn. The answers remain as elusive as the shadows that dance among the trees when the sun sets over the peaks, and perhaps that's how it should be. Some stories gaining power not through their conclusions, but through the questions they continue to generate across generations. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadows of the mountains and the mysteries they hold, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories, exploring the forgotten corners of history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this intriguing case, and don't forget to like the video if it captured your imagination. Until the next story.